Once again, we are happy to introduce Ann Lovejoy. Hi, Ann.
Hey, Karen. So I bet that somebody wants to talk about tomatoes because this is one of the worst tomato years ever. Am I right?
For me, definitely. It's so sad. It's the auxiliary leaves and branches that have died off on me. The tomatoes themselves have come through, but the particular branches that have the tomatoes on them seem to be good. But I don't certainly have as many tomatoes as I usually do, but that's okay. The thing is that those auxiliary branches, which used to sort of shade the rest of them, you know, they're all dead. I mean, they are dead.
Well, two things or three things could be part of the issue here. And one of them is, of course, that heat bump that we got in the end of June, that did a real number on a lot of plants for a number of reasons. And part of the reason is that, as I may have mentioned before, when temperatures get over 80 degrees, tomato plants actually abort or lose flowers. They may drop the flowers or they may just become sterile and not be able to function. So we saw a real stop in the production. Like any fruit that was already there that was formed, even if it was tiny, that was going to go on. It had a check and was kind of retarded, put back, but it wouldn't, they wouldn't drop off necessarily. But it took quite a few more weeks to develop fresh flowers that actually were capable of bearing fruit. So that was part of what happened there. And then we got into this crazy cool spell, a hot spell, cool spell, right? We went round and round with this. So the dipping down into the 50s at night is another shock for the plants. And when it's been in the mid to low 50s, which it has pretty consistently, that also gives the plant a check or literally retards its growth. So then they're trying to put their resources to good use, but when it's cold like that, they don't take up nutrients the way they do in warm weather, because almost all the nutrients are taken up by the new growth tips of the roots. And when the roots are stunned or checked by cold or heat, they're not doing much growing, so they don't take up much nutrients. So it's harder for them to access whatever fertilizers you may have been offering. It's still worth putting on some fertilizer for tomato plants every second or third week, if diluted, probably half strength, because they will still take that up and it will help them grow. But the leaves that yellowed and browned and fell off most likely were cold or had been scalded and then got cold. And either way, they were not happy campers.
No, they weren't. They were awful. They kept telling me, I don't like this.
Yep. And you can do a couple things. You can wrap them in bubble wrap at night. If you're around a lot and you're there, you can actually kind of pay attention to everybody. You can bubble wrap around your plants at night and leave it on until like today, it started warming up at about 10 o'clock, right? Before that, it was 50s and then it sort of hit the 60s, but it was 62 maybe. And tomatoes are pretty happy between about 60 and 78. And, we think of them as jungle plants, and they are, but they're understory plants typically. And so that's why the leafy protection in a hot summer is really valuable, because it shields the plants and keeps them from scalding. But in a summer like this, it's okay if they don't have much protection from the sun that isn't really shining very much anyway, right? So I would just say, if tomatoes, don't feel bad, it's not you. It really has been the roughest year for tomatoes. But the ones that mine are plugging along. I have really switched over, so I almost entirely grow smaller ones. Things like Seattle's Best, which is sort of not even, it's sort of baseball sized at best, right? Or, bigger than a golf ball, but not much. And I grow a lot of cherry tomatoes because we tend to successfully ripen those better. They don't need as much heat as something like Early Girl, which just does not love the Northwest, or this part of the Northwest.
I've been using stew peas.
And stew peas is good because it was bred in Russia, and Russia has, being quite north, has longer summers but very long winters, and so they have a pretty short condensed season, though they do tend to have a lot of sun in that short season. But yeah, so if this year we're just all reeling with the temperature, the swings, and the weather.
I just don't want them to think that I didn't love them. Okay, so now I've got tomatoes in there, some of them which will end up being in a bag with a banana because they're going to have to get ripe that way. And I need to put them in the oven, and we need to do it for what, 200 for an hour?
225. If you're going to roast your tomatoes, whether they're green or red or in between, cut them in half. Oil the pan with a high temp. Well, it doesn't really matter because you're not taking them up high. If you do high roasting, I usually use avocado oil because that's a higher temp.
Yeah, that's what
For
I use.
low roasting, you can use pretty much whatever you want, and put them cut side down. I know that a lot of places say cut side up, but I think they do better cut side down personally. And then at 225 is the lowest a lot of ovens will go, on a rimmed baking sheet so you don't get drippy crap all over your stove. Ask me how I learned that. And yeah, it takes, usually depends on the size of the tomatoes you're doing, but and how crowded the pan might be, but anywhere from like 45 to 60 minutes, even maybe a little longer if they're bigger or you have a lot on the pan. And they'll be, you're not going for crispy, you're going for leathery. And then I usually freeze them, put them right into a freezer container, seal it, and then that you can spoon out what you want, or put them in. I have a dedicated ice cube tray with a silicone top. I don't know if you've seen those. And that way you can freeze them and then pop those cubes out and then put those in a sealed freezer container and just put in one or two to give a sauce a little bit of a zip. Same with basil. When I have excess basil, which I have a ton of this year, that's done really, really well. I just grind it up with some oil and do the same thing, freeze it like that. And then instead of making whole pesto and freezing that, you just freeze the concentrated herbs, because one of the things that can happen in the freezer is that things like garlic and even nuts can get a little rancid or pick up freezer flavors, whereas the straight herbs or herbs with oil will not do that.
Oh, this is good information.
Yeah, or they may do it after like 6 or 8 months, but they're not going to do it quickly. And sometimes the garlic can get funky pretty fast.
Yeah.
So that's one of the better ways to kind of preserve that flavor of summer for a longer time.
Thank you, Anne. I'm feeling a little bit better.
Good. The other thing to think about right now is herb salt. And you can do that with basil, you can do it with cilantro, you can do it with rosemary, you can do it with thyme. And with basil salt, I do it literally 1 per 1, like 1 cup of chopped leaves and 1 cup of kosher salt, and grind it together and then bake it off 225 in a rimmed baking sheet until it crusts over, usually 20-25 minutes. Break it up, put it back in the quiz, buzz it up till it's salty, and then that will stay. And I made 2 quarts already this year, but I give it to people for Christmas presents.
Oh.
It's bright green. It's beautiful. And when you open a jar or sprinkle some on a fresh tomato or some mozzarella or a salad or a stir fry or scrambled eggs, it's incredible.
So you say 1 cup of rosemary or 1 cup crushed up, or
No, that's just when I do basil. For rosemary and things like that, I do about a 1/4 cup. Rosemary, lemon, garlic, that kind of stuff. 1/4 cup to a cup.
All right. Hey, Randy, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Hello, Ann.
Hi,
Karen.
Randy.
Hi, Sheila. We had a border of Photonia that kind of got the disease and a lot of leaves, so I cut out a lot of stuff, cleared out a lot. And I wanted to put a border back up, and so I tried some laurel.
Uh-oh.
And so some of the laurel, like I have about 5 laurel plants, and 2 of them are like turning all brown and leaves are falling.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Photinia, as you've discovered, doesn't really like the Northwest winters at all, and it will get that leaf spot really, really readily. It's also pretty big. It's one of those big rangy plants that's kind of a small tree, large shrub, and it can easily get to 20, 30 feet. Same with laurel. Yes. Even if you get the what's so-called skip laurels that are supposed to be on the smaller side, they still get 12 to 15 feet. And because they want to get that high, they'll also get that wide, which means those roots will all be spreading 12 to 15 feet wide, even if you clip them back and try to maintain them as a smaller plant or shear them to give them a certain size, they will still spread the roots out that far. So if you planted the laurels where the Photinia had been, they're probably running into old roots and root rots that remain in the soil. So I would suggest maybe thinking about a trellis fence or a some kind of visual block fence for instead of trying to use plants. What's on the other side that you don't want to look at?
The road.
Well, you
Just the
know,
roads.
actually, a wooden fence will give you a whole lot more protection from noise, dust, smoke, exhaust, and all that stuff than any plant is really able to do. Plants are not very good at screening noise.
Yeah, it's just more visual because you can see into the house from the road, the side road.
Yeah, so you know, a fence would really probably serve you better. Otherwise, one thing to maybe do is to really have, you know, when I have a lot of big excavating to do and really digging out roots and things like that, I use the first principle of sustainability, which is to cause it to be done by others, which means you rent strong, strapping young people and they dig out all the roots and do the really hard work. That, you know what, it's not worth it. So once
about 2/3 of the Fittonia died. I cleared out a lot of the bramble, and so some of the Fittonia still look fairly good. There's a few black spots, but they look still pretty healthy, and I do want them tall. So
okay, yeah, I guess then, you know, clearing whatever you can, removing the dead, clearing out the soil really well in places that plants are not persisting. Something's going on there. And I would layer on a lot of compost and then some wood chips, not bark. Bark is not a good thing to put on your soil, but wood chips will really help, and do them thick, like 6 to 8 inches deep. And then wait until the rains come back, which God knows when that's going to be, because it has been so crazy. We were in a, you know, this is the 4th year of a pretty serious drought. But say October, November, it's a good time to plant because the soil starts to really be wet through at that point. Plus, at that time, usually a lot of plants are on sale at the nursery. So it's a double bonus, right? But really think about making sure that soil is cleaned out first and then put on a healing layer of compost. And I mean 3 to 4 inches of compost and maybe 4 to 6 inches of chips, and let that stand for 6 months or whatever, you know, because that, and then leave it. Like when you plant, just scrape away enough to be able to plant the plant and then leave the rest there. And I would do that along the whole border of your hedge, because that's really going to improve the soil for those plants. And be aware that, you know, Photinia and Laurel both, like I said, get really, really big. So you can't plant anything in front of them for about 10 to 15 feet without running into root issues over time.
Okay. Yeah, no, we wanted them big, so that's good. Thank you.
Sure. I was going to talk a little about, well, we did sort of touch on climate change. And one of the best things we can do to prevent that is really to garden our own little, whatever space we have as best we can. And I know it can feel really discouraging, like if you just have a balcony or you just have a tiny little patch. But what we're discovering is that actually there's far more benefit to even small strips of wild wilderness than there was ever thought before. So that those blackberries behind your hedge, maybe a rough area along the edges of your property where there's a mixture of wild plants, native plants, and what we think of as weeds or garden escapees, that could be the richest, most sustainably supportive part of your whole yard for pollinators and birds and other small creatures. And we don't think of it that way. But the thing about lawns is that they're really a monoculture, and they don't support anything except mowing service people. And that's not really a benefit to the planet, right? So I'm big in favor of like losing the lawn and putting in instead either sustainable ground covers or mixtures of pollinating plants, and making, like in front of your hedge, you could have a big wide strip of pollinator plants that would support all kinds of creatures, including beneficial insects, bees, ladybirds, all kinds of stuff, and birds. Many, many birds will come. One of the fun things about the garden we just put in at the senior center is it's full of pollinator plants and sunflowers, and we're just seeing every day little birds come and eat the seeds right out of the sunflowers, even though they're not dry yet. they're green, they're not ripe, but the birds eat them anyway. And thinking about how we're sustaining that little patch, it's not very long, it's not very big, but it is full all day long of bees and hoverflies and bumbles and birds. And I just think what a richness we're creating with just a, really a handful of plants. Right? And so
Yeah.
even you gals with balconies, one of the things you can always do with that is have big pots of herbs like rosemary and oregano are two of the longest blooming herbs that almost all pollinators will visit and appreciate. Even our native bees will visit them. So that's a real bonus, and it's not hard to do, right? And lots of annuals that are simple flowers, because bees and pollinators have a hard time accessing doubles. Those frilly double flowers, it's hard to get in there, right? So they prefer single, more open forms. So calendulas, California poppies, long blooming things like sweet alyssum, they'll be covered in, you'll get a haze of pollinators for months and even kind of around the year, because things like calendula and sweet alyssum will keep on blooming. If you cut them back, they'll bloom and bloom and bloom again and again. And they keep blooming even into the winter time.
Can you name some of the sustainable plants for the replacing the lawn?
Yeah, well, like I said, there, in my little garden and in the senior center garden, we have I think we have a dozen kinds of oregano, for one thing. And there are many, many forms, and many of them are decorative, but their blooms are extremely attractive to pollinators. And the seeds then get eaten by finches. The goldfinches will come and eat the seeds, which is kind of wonderful.
Yeah,
Sunflower.
we got rid of most of the grass already. We just have a little bit left.
Oh, great. Well, then, yeah. And, all kinds of native plants will do really well. The California poppies, for instance, are actually native up and through the coast. And that's a good one that will, if you cut them back periodically, they'll keep blooming and blooming and blooming for months, almost year round. And if you cut them back, you'll notice new growth at the base. Cut back to that and it'll sprout out a whole new set of flowers. Another really good long bloomer is called catmint or Nepeta. And that one it's the same kind of thing. It throws out long arms covered with blue flowers, blooms for months. And when it starts to fade, you'll see at the base a new flush of bright new growth, and you cut back all the old stems and those will bloom again. You can do that 3 times in a season and you get blooms from pretty much April all the way through to November.
Yeah, we're looking more just for ground cover, more so than flowering, because like I said, 2/3 of what was lawn is now gardens with flowers, and it's just overgrown with flowering plants.
That's
But
great.
The rest of the space where you do want to walk around, but you don't want grass.
Well, 2 good ideas. You can do paving stones, big ones, nice big pavers to walk. And then in between, there's a couple things. One's called New Zealand grass buttons, or Cotulus squalida. And that's a little feathery looking ground cover. There's green forms and sort of purpley black forms that are kind of dramatic. And they're soft on your feet. They're feathery. They're really nice to walk on. And they have little funny flowers that look like little buttons. And so New Zealand brass buttons is a really good walkable ground cover, especially in a shady area. But in sunnier areas, I like to use chamomile or there's a blend called Eco Lawn or Fleur de Lawn, like Fleur de Lis, that are mixtures of flowers like low growing daisies and different kinds of veronica and some forget-me-nots and things like that, things that are low and naturally low growing grasses. So there's mixtures called low mow or no mow, and they will get at the most maybe 4 to 6 inches long. So if you mowed them once or twice a summer, that's all you need to do. And lots of small flowers all mixed in. And again, you probably want to put paving stones down, but it makes a nice, it's called a tapestry lawn because it looks like those old tapestries, the European ones where somebody's always patting a unicorn on the head and that kind of thing. You know what I mean, right?
Yes, I do.
We have a lot of the California poppies out in front of our apartment building here. And how would I transplant those into a pot or what?
No, they're like all poppies, they're tap rooted and they don't transplant very readily, but they're easy from seed. So if you look at the pods on a California poppy, they're these long curved like little swords, and they start to turn brown. You can pick them and put them in a pot, I stick them upright, 3 or 4 pods, and let them pop. And when they pop, they split open and sort of shoot their seeds out. Or you can lay them on their side and they'll open, that way they'll open when they're ready and they'll sow their seeds, and you should get plenty of seedlings that way very quickly. Another one you could think about, I've been talking about oreganos. There are quite a few creeping oreganos that make a real beautiful deep blanket. They're evergreen. And so that would be one to look for too. There's not the ornamental ones, but the ones that are used more for culinary purposes. And there are many of those. And they're carpeters. And so you'd get this beautiful dense green carpet all year, and then low sprays of flowers in the summertime. And then you can just either mow or leave them there, and they'll just spread and spread, and they're beautiful.
So does that mean I have to make pizza with the oregano for all you?
Yes.
Yeah, there you go. Well, if you ever want to make pizza or pasta sauce, you just go pick a sprig. You don't have to actually do it. Here's the interesting thing. When you buy herbs and plant them, no one obligates you to cook with them. There's no follow-up at all. I know. So you can get away with just having benign neglect and growing, but herbs are fabulous for pollinators of all kinds. So rosemary, thyme, sage, lavender, all those hardy, tough winter green herbs are really good for promoting pollinators. And the thing about our native pollinators is most of them are happy with native wildflowers, but almost all our native wildflowers, with a few exceptions, stop blooming pretty early, like May. Mm-hmm. So to carry on and make sure that all the pollinators have other things to support them, we need to sort of branch out a little bit. And many, many pollinators are generalists. They don't really care where the stuff comes from. They just want their pollen and nectar. So they're ones that will be perfectly happy to keep feeding on garden plants of all kinds.
Okay, so you're talking about the lavender. How do I get lavender from the ground outside my apartment building into a pot?
Well, you can't transplant lavender either, really, once it's a grown-up plant. But right about now, you can take tip cuttings of, especially if there's any branches that have not bloomed, that don't have a bloom stalk attached to them. You can take off about a 3-inch piece, strip a little off the bottom, and stick them in a pot out of the direct sun. And a lot of times those tip cuttings that are taken at this time of year will root pretty well.
Okay.
Speaking of edible plants, I have some potato plants that volunteered from the compost, and I moved them and are growing some, but some of the leaves have died back. Yeah,
when the leaves die back, that means it's ready to harvest.
Oh, okay.
Some people harvest when the plants start to bloom, and you can do that. The tough thing about harvesting potatoes, especially volunteers, is you don't know where they are. And so I always seem to dig them up and stick the fork right through a bunch of them. And that just means potato salad tonight.
Oh, I use my hands.
Well, one thing you'll notice is a lot of potatoes grown around here actually have a kind of a rough looking brown coat. And that's actually something called scab that acid soils promotes in a lot of different kinds of potatoes. There are, you don't see it much on red-skinned potatoes, and some of the fingerlings are pretty resistant, but a lot of the russets and the regular, potatoes, they do get scabby. It's not bad. It doesn't even taste particularly bad, but generally you want to peel those just to get that off. And then I would definitely put a little, make compost in that soil and get it cleaned up.
Okay, yeah, the volunteers were all red pages, so we don't see the scab, but that's good. So I'll start eating them.
Yeah, they're not keepers usually. You have to cure potatoes to have them keep very well. And so when they're freshly dug, you probably want to eat them pretty fast.
Okay.
I was going to talk about heat damaged plants. I don't know if people saw scorching. A lot of the hydrangeas, for instance, got really blasted and the leaves are all kind of curling. That's okay. You don't have to do anything to them. And you can see a lot of them have put on new growth. But a lot of the flowers that were blooming at the time of that heat bump got kind of fried too. And I would cut those off because you don't want the plant to go to all the extra work of trying to set seed when they're trying to also heal themselves. That's one strong thing you can do to protect a plant that's been heat damaged, is remove any flowers or fruit so that it doesn't have to waste, because what it will do is put all its energy into creating seed or ripening fruit, and then it will die. But if you remove those temptations and just let it focus more on trying to get its roots restored, or maybe put out some new foliage, then you have a much better chance of bringing that plant through for another year. And the other thing to never ever do when a plant has had a real struggle with like that is feed it. You don't want to feed a perennial or a shrub or a tree that's been really struggling, because they can't take it in, and it's sort of asking too much. First of all, it's kind of wasteful, but also it can overload them and kind of stress them out, and then they can't really function. It's like giving a chemo patient a giant steak dinner. They can't take it in.
No, they can't.
Now, tomatoes are a bit of an exception, because those annuals are going to keep trying to grow. And so you're not working on a perennial plant with storage roots or anything like that. So with your tomatoes, yeah, they got that hit in the heat bump, and now they're struggling with the cold, but you can continue to feed them, though I would dilute it a little and do kind of half strength, because they still need help to kind of get through. And, you know, who knows, some years they'll still be, you can pick tomatoes all the way through September and October sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
I've had years where we had tomatoes at Christmas because autumn was better weather than the summer was. And we may have one of those years, who knows? The other thing to think about is all the smoke we've had puts a coating of particles on the foliage of a lot of our plants. And so because it hasn't really rained, though yesterday it tried, did you notice a little sprinkle?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not enough to wash the leaves off. Now, in summertime, we always say you want to water the plant roots, not the foliage. But after an event like the smoke that we've had, you kind of do want to water the foliage, but wash it in the morning so that it has all day to dry and doesn't go into the nighttime wet, because that's when we can get molds and mildews building up pretty fast. But because that smoke, it's sort of a greasy, you don't have to use wax and shine on anything, but just rinse and help open up the pores on the leaves that take in nutrients, because plants capture a lot of nitrogen from the air, but when those pores are blocked, they can't really, they can't do their photosynthetic thing as easily. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Hey, Reed, do you have any questions?
How to transition from our traditional hodgepodge lawn, which includes a variety of things, to the lawn that you talked about in your lovely blog post, which just told us to go there, but didn't quite tell us how to get there.
So there's a couple ways that you can transition from a traditional lawn to a pollinator sustaining meadow, or fleur-de-lawn, eco-lawn, whatever you want to call it. And one way is to do it gradually. If you don't have a ton of energy or time, or you don't want to invest a lot of money, and I see some hands going up, then you just use like an edging tool or a sharp shovel, take off about a yard of width and all the length of along a border or walkway or whatever you want. And you can literally chop with a shovel, have two people, one person rolls and the other person chops the roots away, and you can roll up the turf. And around here, the turf is pretty easy to discourage because it's usually pretty crappy anyway. And you roll that up and you can pile, stack turf in sections, maybe like a 4-foot chunk, like a rug, and you put green side down and then brown side back to back, and then green sides back to back, and then brown side back to back. And you make a little hill, wet it, cover it with a tarp, and leave it alone. And in a year or so, you'll have a really nice pile of compost there instead. And the soil that is underneath that patch will be open and really beautiful. So if you do that consistently throughout the garden, you'll start opening these patches. Then you have this bare soil that's not really very good. So that's where I would put down humic acid granules, which you can buy at Ace or any of the nurseries. And depending on the formula, it'll tell you on the package what the distribution rate is, but usually I scatter it like chicken food, kind of, right? And just scatter it down, put some compost on top of that, a couple inches, wood chips generously, and not bark. Bark is really not the same as wood chips, but I like the wood chips for several reasons. They help the soil retain moisture. They shade out the weed seeds, so you get less germination. They also, as they rot down, replenish the soil. And they really kind of shelter little baby plants as they're starting to sprout, which is great. So if you tuck little seedlings in there, they'll do really well, better than they will in a big, vast oasis of baking hot, dry soil. right? They make a little mini protection bubble of moist, cooler air around small plants. So when we're putting in fall plants, for instance, that's a really good way to protect them and make sure that they grow evenly and don't get shocked by the heat or shocked by the cold. And so if you want to do that with seedlings, for the cheapest way to do it is with seeds, right? And we talked a little about salvaging. California poppy seeds, for instance, are a great one for pollinators, and they do really well around here because they are essentially native up through this area in some places. And so if you have, like, if you walk by a place every day that has California poppies around it, which many of us do, you'll notice those long sword-shaped little seed pods. And if they're green, don't pick them. But as they start to get brown or golden, you can pick them, bring them, and scatter them around, and they'll pop open when they're ready. And those seeds will sprout through the winter and be up in late winter, early spring, and already blooming by the time you could get something going in the spring. And seeds that you can do well that way with are things like sweet alyssum, California poppies, calendulas, which also there's tons of them, and they have lots of big brown curly seeds on them right now. And things like Lovejoy is another popular one. Those are really good all-purpose pollinator plants that will make many, many kinds of pollinators happy. The other thing we can do as autumn comes and the soil is wet and we can start digging up, if you have plants like thyme and oregano, I was discussing earlier how many kinds of oregano there are, and many are ornamental and some are culinary, but they're still quite beautiful and make beautiful, deep, dark mats, low growing mats of evergreen leaves. All of those could be pulled apart. So you could take a piece that was this big and make probably 15 or 20 little pieces out of it and space those a foot or two apart. And within a season, you'll have a whole sheet of it, right? And every year pull that apart and make more and make more. And that's the way to get ground covers going too. If you don't want to spend a fortune, you buy ground covers that spread rapidly. And in the winter time, like either October, November, or wait again until sort of middle of January into February, those are the seasons when you can take those ground covers plants, like whether it's oregano or Corsican mint or the New Zealand brass buttons we talked about before, you can pull them into small pieces and space them apart 6 to 8 inches or a foot, and they'll carpet for you and spread more and more and more. And you can do that over and over, and you've made yourself a really nice bunch of plants for not that much money. So that would be the strip method. I really recommend that because for most people to open up a huge expanse of Kansas, soil means a real commitment of time and money and effort. And
or just paying a lot of money to have somebody do it for you, which takes some of the joy out of it too.
It does. And you never know whether they'll do really a fabulous job or not. But yeah, I mean, I do recommend having other people do really hard, heavy work, like removing really big masses of blackberry roots and things like that. I think that's worth paying for muscle for that kind of thing. But for most of it, if you just do a patch at a time, maybe you do a square the size of your kitchen table. And then next, just keep doing a little more and a little more and a little more. And over time, you'll see which plants are the most successful at pulling in the pollinators. And I will put a list of pollinators, and I will put a description of how to change over the lawn in my blog, as you said. But I think one of the things to think about is almost all the hardy herbs. Like I said earlier, rosemary, sage, lavender, thyme, oreganos of many kinds of types, all those are incredible magnets for many kinds of pollinators. And mint is a tricky one. Mint is, as everybody knows, an incredibly aggressive, fast-moving, very expansive plant, but it has its place. For one thing, all pollinators adore mint. That's another complete pollinator magnet. For another, if you have heavy clay and it's really hard to dig and you start to fork it over and it's like big, crumbly, dry, mucky mass, mint can be transformational for soil like that. And one of the, when we did the library gardens many years ago, we were given flats and flats of about, several dozen kinds of mint. And we planted it all over the place. And it was such poor soil and such heavy, dark blue clay. that was just weeping in this, and plants, if you dug a hole to plant something, it would just drown because the clay sealed it off like a little clay bathtub. So we planted mint all over those borders along Madison. And over time, the mint wove its roots down and through. And when we started pulling it up, it went down like a foot easily. And that whole top part of the soil had been broken open, and we started to find worms. So, you know, mint has its place. It's like nature's shovel. And if you've got time and space, I highly recommend planting a bunch of different kinds of mint. I mean, everybody likes mojitos, right? Or you can do, you know, mint tea or whatever you want, but it's a really good tool for opening garden soils that are tricky, that are heavy like that. And then you have to kind of remember to keep moving with it. Like, you can't let it stay there forever, or that's all you will have. But it is also got an evergreen mat at the base, and it certainly doesn't need any help from us.
I love their little blossoms too, the little purpley. Oh, the pollinators just love them.
Yeah, so you'll see they can be purple or pink or white or pale yellow, depending on the kind, because, you know, there's chocolate mint and orange mint and peppermint and spearmint and all kinds, you know, caraway mint. There's many, many, many kinds. And I think it's fun to have a little bit of that at least. But, you know, it doesn't have to be huge exotic things. Sunflowers, as I said earlier, are very attractive to a wide range of pollinators and very attractive to a wide range of birds too. So you can get, you know, double hits off a lot of plants like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I loved how you were talking about how soil it captures carbon. And,
yeah, and there's been some really interesting studies in the last few years that bare soil loses carbon. And as soon as you dig, you release carbon that's been stored for thousands of years, basically. Poof, it just gets released into the air. And that's why tilling is really not a preferred practice anymore. Rather than till, you just want to layer amendments on. But one of the cool things that they've just recently discovered is that as little as a 1/4 inch of compost helps soil start restoring carbon drawdown almost immediately, like within days. And so here in the Northwest, because we tend to have these rainy seasons, you want to put more on than you would, say, back east somewhere where the rain distribution is different. But here we can put several inches on, and it will get moved into the soil through the action of the living creatures. The soil biota, the soil food web, is as intricate as the food web on the top surface is. We're more familiar with that one, but the soil itself is full of living creatures, and there's a lot of them. And it's been estimated that there are at least multiple millions of creatures in a teaspoon of garden soil, possibly billions in good garden soil. So it's very lively in there. And to keep it happy, we want to make sure it's not exposed, because light, heat kills off everything in the top 1/4 inch or so. And digging also brings up all the, like I said, the stored carbon and so forth, which kind of releases a flush of nutrients to plants, but then it's gone. And so to restore it, you want to cover it up with a blanket, put the compost down. I usually put the humic acid down on first, again, because granulated humic acid is one of the active ingredients. Fulvic acid and humic acid are what makes compost so effective. And granulated humic acid will start to work. It's not fertilizer, it's a soil conditioner. And so you can put that down and then put compost on top, and it will sort of synergistically help the compost work better and faster. And then again, wood chips on top, and they don't have to be fine. They can be pretty coarse and still do a very good job. If you don't like the look, you can go for finer wood chips. But again, don't get bark, because bark sheds water, and that is a real problem for plants in our dry summers. The last thing you need is something that's keeping the plants from getting any moisture, right? But that's one of the most healing ways you can convert soil. One of the worst things we can do is have bare earth. And I just cringe when I see these lawn services come in with their blowers. And first of all, they put down compost or mulch, and then they blow it all off, and then they rake it off, and then they blow it off some more. So it's like a tsunami hitting the soil, and then you see the exposed roots of the plants. I mean, it's really like, it's disgusting to me. But kindness involves cozy blankets, nice little moisture, just enough, right? And we can, once we get it set up, we can not, you don't have to work so hard. In other words, if you do a proper prep the first time, you can leave it in place, and then every year or two, you can add another layer. If you put down wood chips, you can still put compost on top of them. If you put down compost, you can put wood chips on top of them. So you just keep layering and layering, and over time, you'll get really fabulous open soil. Our native soils here on the island especially are very nutritive, but they're low in a couple things. They're kind of low in calcium, and they are low in humus. And so adding the compost and wood chips is increasing the humus. And calcium, you know, it sort of depends on the plant. Our native plants don't need a lot of it. That's why we don't have native snails. All the snails that we have are imports. That's why we're rich in slugs, but poor in snails. Our only snails are water snails because there's more water in the stream beds from leaching out of rocks than there is in our native soils. But all our soils really need to be extremely nutritive, and helping plants grow well is more humus and protection from erosion and heat.
Excellent.
I know, it's great. We live in one of the best, I mean, if you walk through the woods, undisturbed woods, the Pacific Northwest rainforest is one of the 4 most abundant areas in the world for what's called life zones. And life zones describe areas where different kinds of plants can live. Costa Rica is the richest, as the intersection between North and South Americas, right? And the Pacific Northwest, I think, is the 4th highest. It's pretty amazing. So we really do, you know, we have the luxury of this incredible soil and this beautiful, abundant native flora. I think we're incredibly fortunate.
I think so. Yeah. Such a beautiful place to live. So I just read in, I don't know if you get Yes Magazine, but they had an article. It's called "The Climate Solution Right Under Our Feet." And it talked a lot about what you just talked about, Ann, about, you know, how soil really can be part of the solution.
Well, it should be part of the solution. One of the things we've just learned too is that mature trees store carbon much deeper into the soil than was previously thought. And so earlier studies that measured carbon absorption at shallower levels weren't finding it. So they thought that trees didn't really do the job they do. But when other studies that looked deeper found a lot more carbon. So that's the other piece that for many, many years, I used to say, don't water our native trees. They're adapted to our dry summers. But now that we've been having these drought years with dry winters too, we're way behind, really. If you look at the last 5 years or 10 years, we're at a definite drought situation, and we see native trees struggling. So now I say, do water your native trees, and not right up around the neck. The neck is not where they're drinking. They're drinking where their roots are. And again, their roots are out. But if you have a wooded area, especially near the house, I would be putting sprinklers out on a weekly basis. And it will do a couple things. It will keep your trees a lot happier and healthier. And God forbid, should there be a wildfire, those trees that are well watered are much more resilient than trees that are tinder dry. I mean, that only makes sense, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I just put in a whole bunch of chives at the senior center. I don't know if you noticed that, but I can divide those. Maybe that's what we should do in the fall, is like divide up some of this stuff and put out starts for people.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah, like I said, I think I put in a dozen kinds of oregano, and we put in some thyme, and we put in chives, and rosemary's and stuff you have to do with root the tips. And you can do rosemary and lavender, sage and things like that. In August, or again in October, November is another good time to do tip rooting.
Yeah. So Ann, are you going to come back next month?
Yes, and next Tuesday, I believe it is, on the last Tuesday of every month, we meet in person, and we are going to be doing a little selective weeding and looking at the way the plants are growing in the front garden, how that's doing, and then we're thinking about renovating the back. And I have about 18 hardy fuchsias that I'm potting up to put in. They're just little plants, but we're going to remove some of the stuff in the back and renovate that soil. And then we're going to be putting in a whole bunch of hardy fuchsias back there, so that when you look through the front door of the senior center, you'll see clear to the back, you'll see a row of hardy fuchsias. And then I think we'll put maybe some epimedium behind that too for winter.
Yeah,
Lovely, lovely.
sounds beautiful.
It'll take time, but I think it's fun to do, hands-on stuff together. It's
What time are you doing it on Tuesdays?
the last Tuesday of every month from 10 to 12.